Hello, we're very excited today to unveil the new IDE enhancements of PowerBuilder 2019 R3. Normally when we reach a revision, especially a third revision of a major release, there's not many major changes to the functionality, minor enhancements of features, and bug fixes. And typically in a third or fourth revision, you're looking at a long-term support. But before we talk about the IDE enhancements in R3, let's take a brief overview of some of the enhancements overall that we've done for R3. There's a really exciting new feature called Power Client, which automates the deployment of client-server applications. So this can be configured to be deployed on-premise or from a remote web server, and does not require any code changes, just basically configuration and setting up a web server, and really helps with automating not only the initial installation but also updates of the application. And there's a number of IDE enhancements that we'll be going in depth in today's webinar. And also R3 features a number of visual enhancements. The Chromium web browser control, which was added in PowerBuilder 2019 R2, has been greatly enhanced. Now you can go beyond just displaying web content and actually integrate your PowerScript with JavaScript that is contained within the web browser. And there are a number of APIs that enable that. 64-bit is something that's on Appeon's roadmap. We're committed to closing the gap on the 64-bit features. And one of the areas that has been a gap is the rich text edit. So now when you're using the TX text control for 32-bit, there's also a 64-bit version. And what we've done is gone ahead and incorporated a newer version of TX text control, version 28, that has bug fixes as well as a number of new features. Now these new features are not yet exposed through PowerScript. There are ways to access that through Olay. But it also paves the way in our roadmap for us to add more of those rich text edit controls natively in PowerScript. And accessibility has been an area that we've greatly improved as well in R3 by supporting Microsoft's UI automation framework. And accessibility is not only important for our visually impaired users, but also if you plan on using RPA tools, or remote process automation, to automate various processes in your application. RPA tools typically rely on the Microsoft UI automation APIs to access content and data in your PowerBuilder application. And also R3 features a new SQL Server driver, MS OLADB SQL. This is not to be confused with the old OLADB that PowerBuilder had some years ago. This driver is what Microsoft is recommending customers to use in place of the native client, which Microsoft deprecated some years ago. So this is a great time now to switch your native driver to the OLADB. And what's nice about the OLADB is it's a native interface. It's not going to have any feature degradation or performance degradation compared to the native client, and should not require any code changes. And lastly, R3 is a long-term support version. Our website explains our EOL policy, but in a nutshell, a long-term version gives you a minimum of 5 years of updates and bug fixes and technical support. So without further ado, let's take a look at the IDE enhancements. This is really big. What we've done is decoupled the IDE and runtime. In the past, anytime a new version of PowerBuilder shipped, it was always the IDE plus the runtime, and the versions had to match. So if you're using, in the past, PowerBuilder 2019 R2 build, let's say 1928, your runtime was the same. And anytime there was a change to the IDE or runtime, you have to update both. It was one package. And also, one IDE in the past could not target multiple runtimes. So if you're using 2019 R2, it could only deploy to a 2019 R2 runtime. So starting with R3, this is a major difference, and normally we don't do major changes, but we felt it was really important to do this and not wait for the next major version, but bring this to you right away in revision 3. So by decoupling the IDE and runtime, now PowerBuilder 2019 R3 and going forward would be able to target multiple runtimes. So for example, like, when we get to PowerBuilder 2021, for example, 2021 that IDE could deploy to not only the PowerBuilder 2021 runtime, but also to the 2019 R3, which is an LTS version. As another example, let's say you jump to PowerBuilder 2022, revision 2. That could target all the way from the 2022 R2 runtime back to 2019 R3 LTS. And as a general rule, of course there might sometimes be exceptions, but the general rule, a new IDE version would support all runtimes that are not EOL. So basically, when you're on one LTS version of the IDE, it's going to support the current LTS runtime all the way back to the last LTS runtime. So let's assume that 2022 R3 is our next LTS to replace 2019 R3 LTS, then that IDE would be supporting all the way back to 2019 R3. Now, one thing just to clarify is that there are unsupported runtimes. You won't be able to target every single possible runtime with a new version of the IDE. It's not going to be able to target newer versions of the runtime if you're on an older version of the IDE, and it's not going to target any runtime that is no longer eligible for technical support. Okay. Now, let's take a look at in practical terms, how does this decoupling benefit you as PowerBuilder developers, and how you're maintaining your production systems and trying out new versions, or in parallel developing for your next version or release that's going to roll out into production. Well, one thing is you'll be able to benefit from enhanced features of the IDE and fixes by updating your IDE version without affecting your production environment. So let's see how this would work. On the left-hand side, you can see we have our development environment. The black color denotes the IDE, the blue color denotes the runtime. So when 2019 R3 is released, the initial version, you have the IDE and runtime, matching. But and you deploy into production, that environment, and everything's working great. Now, let's say you realize there's a bug in the IDE, and you want to install a maintenance release to resolve that. You're able to just update the IDE with that maintenance release independently and keep the runtime as that version that is working fine, and you don't want to do any retesting or anything like that. So you keep that as 2019 R3, and you can keep maintaining that app you have in production and deploying without worrying that a newer build could introduce potential regression bugs. So this is excellent. You'll be able to keep your IDE updated while keeping your runtime stable and not risking anything in the production environment. Now, let's take a look at a second scenario, how to roll back a runtime update. Historically, that's not something you could really do easily at all. It required uninstalling the PowerBuilder IDE, reverting your pibbles. Then when you reinstall the PowerBuilder IDE, the older version that you're rolling back to, you have to go and reconfigure and set up everything. It's really a hassle. That's all solved now when the IDE and runtime are separate from each other. So let's take a look at this. On the left-hand side, again, our development environment, the black color denoting the IDE, the blue color denoting the runtime. We're on the initial release of 2019 R3. Okay. Now, let's say you discovered a bug, open a support ticket with the runtime. There's an issue there. So you keep your IDE unchanged because there was no issue with the IDE. There was a maintenance release, an MR for the runtime. You apply it in your development environment, and everything looks good, fine and dandy. You roll that out into production. Now, as we all know, nobody's testing is 100% complete. It's possible that no matter how well and thoroughly you tested, you miss something, and when you really roll out in production, you realize, oops, that maintenance release had an issue. And Appeon is not exempt from this. It's not just your testing. No matter Appeon or any company for that matter, I've never seen a software company put out a newer version and there's zero chance of regression and that their testing is 100% perfect. It's just, that doesn't happen. So with being able to roll back, that's a very powerful feature to be able to do so really easily. So you deploy this out to the runtime, to the production environment. Your users find an issue. Now you want to roll back. So how do you do that? It's very simple. You have actually multiple runtimes in your development environment. They can coexist. They don't replace each other. So we have a 2019 R3 runtime. We also have a 2019 R3 runtime that includes the bug fixes, the maintenance release. And we simply switch that out in our IDE and say, now we want to compile our app with 2019 R3 without having to uninstall, reconfigure, revert pibbles, do all of that nonsense. And we simply then recompile and update our production environment, and we're now back to how everything was working great. So we're easily rolling back runtime updates without having to uninstall any runtimes, any PowerBuilder IDE, reconfigure, or revert pibbles. Okay, let's take a look at a third scenario. How to maintain multiple versions. This is very common. A lot of customers have many PowerBuilder apps, not just one. And each time you update the runtime version of a PowerBuilder app, you really should be testing carefully. And since most PowerBuilder apps are large, those testing cycles can take a long time. So it's not uncommon that we see customers on multiple versions of PowerBuilder for this reason. And with this new separation of the IDE and runtime, you'll be able, with a single up-to-date IDE, to be targeting and maintaining apps in multiple runtimes, not just maintenance releases. They could be on different major versions. They could be on different revisions. In this example, we're using 2019 R3 because that's the first version of PowerBuilder that has done this separation, but this applies going forward. So let's say we have two apps. They're all on 2019 R3, and we've deployed them out to production. Now, for whatever reason, there's, let's say, a bug or an issue with one of the applications. So the 2019 R3 is working fine for the first application, but there's some issue that affects the second. Well, we're able to then install that updated runtime in our development environment. So we have two runtimes. We have the 2019 R3 and the newer build that has the maintenance release in it. And we can choose just to use that updated runtime for just the second application. And we could easily switch back and forth between the runtimes if we have to, for example, make changes to the first app, update it to the production environment, and then make code changes to the second app and redeploy that to the production environment so that the second app is running on the updated runtime and the first one isn't. And again, the beauty of this is I won't have to retest the first application, and I won't have to set up multiple environments or VMs to be able to target these different runtimes. In a single development environment, we can do this. So this is really great, and we think it's going to help boost your productivity. Aside from the scenarios we just looked at, this change that we've made with the IDE and the runtime is actually going to help Appeon to be more agile with the product releases. Now, if we look at the situation before we decoupled the IDE and the runtime, our builds would take a number of hours. And so that would realistically mean that we could put out a build every 1 to 2 days. And testing took a long time because anytime we made a change at IDE or runtime, we would have to test both of them due to the dependencies. And so typically it would take 4 to 6 weeks to test any change in the IDE before we could do a final release. And the same was true for the runtime. And so what this meant is that anytime we wanted to make a bug fix or do an enhancement of the IDE, it was really being held up by the runtime. Now, after the separation, let's take a look at how we can move PowerBuilder forward faster. We're now able to compile the IDE and runtime separately, which has greatly reduced the overall compilation time. We can do a build in just a few hours rather than a build every 1 to 2 days. And testing is greatly reduced for the IDE because we can just test the IDE by itself without having to test the runtime. And typically it only takes 1 week to do the QA process for the IDE. Runtime has a lot more features, is more complex, it takes a bit longer, 3 to 4 weeks, but it's still a better scenario than before. So in conclusion, this change that we've made is going to actually enable Appeon to enhance the IDE and runtime separately and bring innovations to you faster. So now that we've talked about one IDE enhancement, and that's major, separating the IDE and the runtime, let's take a look at source control. That's a very big feature. Typically, most PowerBuilder customers are using some sort of source control. These days, most people are starting to switch over to Git and SVN if they haven't already done so. And we've done a major enhancement that if you're already using Git, or you're going to love this. If you're not, well, this is the time to switch over because our Git support is quite robust now. You will be able to create and switch Git branches in the IDE. We have not done SVN yet. That's on the roadmap, but we have much more users using Git, so that was the priority first to add this feature. Now, there is external Git clients like Tortoise Git that would allow you to do some of this stuff, but without integrating in the PowerBuilder IDE, it really wasn't practical and definitely wasn't productive. So now the PowerBuilder IDE supporting this, it's really practical, much more productive to do so, to do branching and merging and so on. Now, another nice thing is that when you move your project from one location on your hard drive to another, your local branch, PowerBuilder will now maintain all of your source control bindings, so you don't have to reconfigure everything. And so that's a nice little productivity benefit too. Obviously not as big of a feature as the first one, but it still saves time if you're moving things around. Another nice little enhancement on the Git and SVN is that whenever you're downloading, when you do a connect to workspace and you're downloading your project from the Git server, there is an option now automatically to refresh all the pibbles after the download. This is something a lot of people forget to do, and it creates some issues sometimes. So by having this option, it's great. Improves your productivity, not having to troubleshoot, issues that are caused by not refreshing. It's also more convenient now to edit conflicts. So if you're working with Git and you made a change and you're trying to commit it and there's a conflict, you can, from within the PowerBuilder IDE, now launch the conflict resolution tool to edit those conflicts. And one thing that we've done is made this feature more international. So we support different encoding formats like ASCII, hex ASCII, UTF-8, and the project directories can contain multi-byte characters. For English users, you won't notice a difference, but PowerBuilder is used worldwide, and we have customers in Japan, in Korea, in the Middle East, where the languages are multi-byte or right to left, and now those characters are not going to be a problem. Now let's take a look at some license management enhancements. The license management is something that actually has affected the productivity of the IDE. We've listened to our customers and improved that. So starting with 2019 R3 and newer, on the same development machine, you can now use your one PowerBuilder license to use multiple versions of the PowerBuilder IDE, not just the multiple versions of the runtime. You could use multiple versions of the IDE at the same time. In the past, you would have to log out of one version and then log into the next version. You couldn't have both two different IDE versions open at the same time, using both of them at the same time. So starting with R3 and newer, you can. So for example, let's say PowerBuilder 2021 comes out next year. and you want to use both IDEs, not only use the PowerBuilder 2021 IDE for whatever reason, you'd be able to do that. You'd install both side by side, and you could have both of those IDs open and working with them simultaneously. Some customers want to do certain automation using command line, and so that's a new thing that we've added where you could launch the PowerBuilder as well as the InfoMaker IDE. You could launch those with a command line, passing in the credentials so that it would log in. So now let's take a look at some miscellaneous IDE enhancements. These are much smaller things, but even small things, when you're doing it daily, dozens of times or maybe even hundreds of times, it really adds up and can actually solve big pains. So the first thing that we've done is allow the system dialogs to be resizable, where you could increase it or decrease it. Normally you wouldn't probably want to decrease it, but you could. Normally you'd probably increase it. So you'll immediately notice that all the various system dialogs are a little bit larger, better laid out, and you can actually go even larger. A lot of us these days have high resolution screens and large monitors, so you can really take advantage of that extra real estate you have. Some of the system dialogs in PowerBuilder don't have so much options and configurations, but some of them do, and I think you'll really appreciate that. Another thing we've done is looked in the IDE and seen where are we clicking a little bit too much and trying to reduce those clicks. And we've started doing that. Obviously there's more we can do, but we've already identified a few areas where we can cut down some of these clicking that you're doing. So one example of that is the browser window. In the past, when you open the browser window and locate an object, you'd have to right click on that object and then select edit. Now you can just directly double click the object to open it in the painter and start editing it. So that eliminates a click. Another example, this actually saves a number of clicks, is if you have a drop-down data window inside of a data window, and now you want to modify the data object, the data window object behind that drop-down data window. So in the past, you would have to find the data window data object name and then go copy and paste it, go to data window, go to browser window, search, locate that object, and then edit it. Now you can directly just click on the drop-down data window, and there's a new modified drop-down data window option in the menu that you can select. And when you do that, it starts to edit the underlying data window data object. Another thing that we've done to help save some clicks is that if you're adding a new column to your data window, in the past, by default, the text in the header band was not enabled and did not have a tab order set. And without that, then your app is not tabbable. And that's something a lot of people use because PowerBuilder apps are data intensive, and using the keyboard and not taking your fingers off really keeps the productivity going. So this saves some clicks for you by default. It is enabled and it is set to 0 because that's the thing people most commonly do. And so the extra click would be for whatever reason you don't want to set the tab order to 0 or you don't want it enabled. But by default it would do that. Another little small enhancement in the IDE is that if you're using PostgreSQL as your database, you have a now show system procedures option in the context menu, where then you can show or hide the system procedures. So in terms of next steps to experience these features and learn more about these features, we definitely recommend you try out the beta today. There will be a final release targeted towards the end of this year or possibly early January. But there's no reason to wait. You can start to play around these features and give us your feedback. All existing PowerBuilder subscribers simply go to the Appeon website. In the top right-hand corner is the downloads link. You just click that and you'll be able to download the beta version. Now, one thing to remind you is that since this is a revision and not a major release, it'll install over the PowerBuilder 2019 R2 if you're already on a 2019 version. So we would recommend, if you're using 2019, to do this download on a separate VM or a separate machine. But if what you're using today is PowerBuilder 2017, then this will not overwrite it at all. You can just go ahead and download this on your same development environment. If you're not an existing PowerBuilder customer, we can arrange for special access to the beta. Just send an email to trial@appeon.com and we'll help you out. Now, you can learn more about the IDE enhancements, but also the other features we've done in R3, the visual enhancements, the Power Client, the new OLEDB driver, and there's other things that we've done for R3 that was not talked about in this webinar. So Elevate 2020 is a great place to learn about that, as well as learn about features we did in 2019 R2, features we did also before then. And Elevate this year is going to be an online conference. It does not require you to travel anywhere. It's COVID-free. It's taking place November 16 and 17. It's 100% free. There's no cost to learn all about the great new features of PowerBuilder and how to effectively use them. This isn't where we just do a song and dance and demo features. It's an educational conference. You're going to get to learn from not only Appeon presenters, but customers out there that are using these things and sharing with you how they use them and different solutions they've been able to develop using these new features. And you can register free at elevate.appeon.com. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Govinda, who is our Appeon tech guru, and he's going to show you these IDE enhancements and how you can use them to boost your productivity.
Thank you, Armin. Hello everybody, I'm Govinda Lopez, and in today's webinar, as Armin just mentioned, I'll show you several enhancements we've done to the IDE. I'll begin with the separation of the runtime from the IDE, then the enhancement to the source control, and finally some miscellaneous enhancements. So let's start with how the IDE has been separated from the runtime. That's right, they are now two different programs. As you can see, this is the PowerBuilder IDE program, and the PowerBuilder runtime is a different program with its own version number. See, IDE is build 2556 and the runtime is 2533. But hey, let's see what this really means. As you can see here below, we have the version of the IDE, which is 2019 R3 build 2556. And see here, this is using the runtime version build 2533. So let's see how I can install an additional runtime version. So I'll start the PowerBuilder installer. See here, it is asking if I want to update my runtime version. If I didn't have a runtime installed, I would only have the install button. I wouldn't have the update. So let's click on update. Notice right here, this is the current version I have installed. And this is the version that it will install for me. So I'll click on update. Even though this will actually not update the runtime, it will rather install a newer version of the runtime. This is something that's different than before. An update would replace the runtime that you had, but now it will install a new version of the runtime alongside the ones currently installed. So let's give it a second for it to download and install. Now that it has finished, let's go back to Control Panel to take a look. See? Here's one version of the PowerBuilder runtime, 2533, and here's the new version, 2556. But now let's see how I can actually select the runtime I want to use in the IDE. So let's go back to PowerBuilder. I'll click on the Tools menu, then click on System Options. Notice right here, this is the PowerBuilder runtime version selector. And if I click on the newly installed version of the runtime, and then apply the changes, I get a message telling me that I need to restart the IDE and perform a full build on my pivots. I'll click OK and then restart the IDE. So if we look down here again, see, the runtime was 2533 and it has been changed to 2556. And I can easily go back to the previous runtime version again. See, it's back to the runtime version 2533. Okay, so it's time now to talk about compiling my app with different runtime versions. So I will now compile this app with this build 2533. I'll open the project object, Now I have two options here. I can compile using P code or machine code. If I select machine code, then the application executable will by default load the runtime files under the same directory as the executable file. If any runtime file is missing under the same directory, it will load the runtime file in the path specified in the environment variable. If I select P code, just like machine code, it will look for the runtime files in the same directory as the executable file. But if it doesn't find the runtime files under the same directory, and that I have deployed the configuration file, it will load the runtime files according to the path in the configuration file like so. But if I haven't specified the runtime path in this configuration file, then it will prompt the application user for the path of the runtime files. Obviously, that is not very user-friendly. The end user is not going to know this path. So we strongly recommend that you add the files to the same directory or add the path to the configuration file. But now let's say that the runtime files are not on the same directory and that there is no configuration file at all. Then it would first try to load the best match runtime, the one used to compile the executable. It will do so from the path in the following order. The path in the system registry. If it cannot find the correct one, then it's going to look in the path in the environment variables. But if it can't still find the best match, it will search again for the second best match in the same order. So I would just click on deploy and the runtime I have selected on the IDE will be used for this compilation. So we have finished compiling successfully the app using the IDE. But now let's take a look at other ways to compile my app without using the IDE. You commonly would not want to use the IDE if you're trying to do automated build or continuous integration. The two options PowerBuilder provides to do such compilation without the IDE is OrcaScript or the PowerBuilder compiler. So let's see what I would need to do to select the runtime version while compiling using an OrcaScript. I would just need to add the runtime version parameter like this. So let's now look at the second option that PowerBuilder provides, the PowerBuilder compiler. So I'll return to the IDE, copy this parameters right here, open up a command prompt with admin rights, type in pvc190.exe, paste the copied parameters, and then I can add the /RT parameter like so. Okay. So let's say that this is my app's production release, but let's also say that there has been some bug fix or enhancement added to the runtime 2556. I like to try it out on my app. Well, in that case, I can just change the runtime version from PowerBuilder like so. I'll restart the IDE, do the full build, and compile my application again. See, it's successfully finished. Then I have a new beta release for my app with a different runtime version. I can also return to the previous runtime version the same way I just did. I can even have different apps with different runtime versions too. I'll open a different app, like this one. Change the version number for the runtime. Apply, okay. Restart the IDE. There we go. Okay, so it's time now to talk about the source control enhancements. So let's say that I have a project in a Git repository. For this example, I'll show you one that I have created in GitHub. See here, I have only one branch. So let's connect to this workspace. I will now connect to workspace. I will select Git. I will now test the connection and it was successful. So now I'll select the checkout directory. Notice this new checkbox. This is one of the enhancements. It will actually refresh the pivals with the source code after downloading. So let's click OK. So it has downloaded everything and it has refreshed the pivals too. So let's look into the next enhancement. You'll notice that we can now see the branch name we will be committing to right in here. I can also create branches and switch branches from within the PowerBuilder IDE. So let's go ahead and create a new branch. I'll name it QA. I will now switch branches to the new one and push everything to that branch. So my code has been pushed properly. See here? Now let's make a change by adding a button to the code in this branch. I'll save the changes, and I can now commit the changes to this branch in my local computer. Let's add a comment and click OK. Okay, now that I have committed to the local, I'll push it to GitHub so that it will also have the changes too. Then I'll switch to the master branch. Notice how my button is in here? Well, that's because this master branch doesn't have these changes made to it. So let's go back to my QA branch. I'll open the window again. See, my button is right here. So now that we have looked into branches, let's look at another cool source control enhancement. So this right here is the folder that contains the source code I was just working on. So now let's pretend that I'm running out of space on my C drive, and I like to move my source code to a different drive or folder. I'll cut this entire folder. Now I'm going to my Y drive and pasting the folder here. I'll now open up this PB workspace again. Okay, so previously I would have lost my source control settings and I would have to set them up again. But with this new enhancement, it keeps the settings even though I changed the location of the folder. Okay, so we have seen the source control enhancements. One of the miscellaneous enhancements we've done is try to reduce the number of clicks that you have to do in the PowerBuilder IDE. One area we have found unnecessary clicks is on the browser window. So let's open the browser window. I'll select any object. Let's say this data window, for example. On previous versions, if I wanted to open the editor for this object, I would have to right-click and then click on Edit. This would open the data window. But on this release, you can directly open it by double-clicking it right here. And this applies to other objects as well in the browser window. See, for example, this window, a user object, etc. And this is much faster, way faster than before. So now let's look at another area where we have found the necessary clicks to enhance. Now, let's say that I want to edit the data window associated with this drop-down data window. Normally, I would have to get the name of the data window, copy it, then search for it, for example, in the browser window, and then open it. But now, all I have to do is just right-click on the drop-down data window column and select Modify Drop-down Data Window. And here's another area with more unnecessary clicks. Now let's say that I want to add another column to my data window. You'll notice that the text object of this column is now enabled by default and that the tab order has been set to 0 by default. Previously, I would have to do this manually after adding any new columns. So you see, these enhancements are actually saving me extra clicks and time. Imagine if you had to do these things hundreds of times a day, then this adds up. Let's take a look at another new miscellaneous enhancements from the IDE. And this one is related to the system dialogs. So in previous versions of PowerBuilder, the system dialogs would look like this. See, you will notice that there are a lot of tabs and it is not resizable. And we have many options in such a little window. And here's another example with the same story. Let's see how they look now enhanced in PowerBuilder 2019 R3. Let's go open the same one that I just showed you. You will notice that the tabs are on a single row, not in 2 rows, and that the size of the window is larger than before, and the window is resizable. And just to clarify, this enhancements apply to other system dialogs. For example, this one too. We hope you try out and enjoy the new IDE Enhancements of PowerBuilder 2019 R3 and learn more about on how to use them at the Elevate 2020 free online conference. Okay, Armin, I think it's now time for the Q&A.